You've probably heard the saying that when you leave the earth, you take nothing along with you. Yet greed continues to consume people's lives. The more we possess, the more we believe we lack. Unlike hunger, which seizes when the stomach is full, the craving for riches has no limit. This leads to obsession and desperation being two peas in a pod that always resurface. Humans have built empires and destroyed ecosystems, exploited millions and labeled it ambition, all in pursuit of wealth that often brings a false sense of happiness. But this dark and eerie fairy tale shows you greed in a much more horrifying form, as well as the consequence that comes with it. It was winter in the village of Mornby and things were awfully quiet. Folk hardly spoke, and if they did, they shivered while doing so. However, in this boring village filled with lies and secrets, there was something that fascinated people. A large, mysterious, peculiar raven that showed up in the early hours of the morning on the coldest day of winter. It would sit on a juniper tree on a field in the village. However, not the evergreen, fragrant wood needle-like leaves type. This tree was dead, and not just in the winter. It wasn't the dryness of the winter grass that frightened the village folk, rather the lack thereof surrounding the tree. They tried planting flowers near it before, but nothing grew there, and anything that seemingly did would always die. But this is where the raven presumably came from. Some also said the raven would sit on the apex of the council rooftop in the morning, watching like it was patiently waiting for something. So why were folks so fascinated by the raven? It pretty much looked the same. But this particular raven didn't just caw in the winter morning. It sang.
Beneath the tree where blood did spill, a golden cradle's deadly still. A meal was served, a feast was made, but not recall the price they paid. Bones beneath the juniper lie, wrapped in roots that never die. A voice was lost, a throat was torn, yet something feathered was reborn. When shadows shrink and bells do chime, the sun will mark her final time. At 12 the truth shall rend the air, and she shall reap what's buried there.
The raven sang this outside a shoe shop, and customers were so impressed by it, it drove sales to the shoemaker. The shoemaker, absolutely grateful, told the raven to take anything that he wanted from the shop. And so the raven did choose something most peculiar for a bird at least. He picked out a pair of the finest red shoes that were too expensive for folk to buy. But the rhyme itself became a catchy tune since morn, being muttered by every villager passing by. Nobody really knew where the raven came from, only that it showed up today, the last day of winter. No one knew what the rhyme meant or who it was recited for, well, except for the only two people who never heard it. There was a middle-aged woman named Gertrude who looked more withered than a winter's tree. She heard a knock on the door. With an expressionless face and repulsive demeanor, she opened the door to see Reverend Marrow, wrapped in his black wool coat and holding a letter sealed with crimson wax. "It's confirmed," he said quietly. "Your petition has been granted. The gemstone will be delivered to you today come 12. She said it's about time. This would be the day she would finally receive what she'd waited years for, the inheritance. Not land, not coin, but a gemstone, one of unnatural beauty, redder than garnet, clearer than crystal. A gemstone so large and heavy that it would take 10 strong village folk to carry and place it on the reinforced wagon. It had passed through 4 generations, always given to the eldest child of the father, and now it was hers. She never cared about her own daughter Marlene, who sat in an abandoned village house staring out the window, paler than the gloomy winter. She had no shoes on. Her feet were turning blue from the cold with shards of glass and splinters stuck inside, and yet Marlene felt numb. She remained silent for so long that many believed she was just a vessel of a soulless body. But the raven knew when the girl stopped talking. He knew why she stopped talking. The raven knew how it all began underneath the juniper tree. Long ago, there was a man and a woman, Alric and Lenora, who loved each other deeply. They lived a simple life. They had everything they could wish for except for a child. Every day, the woman would pray to have a child, even if it cost her her life. In their yard stood a beautiful juniper tree. One winter's day, the woman stood beneath it, peeling an apple. As she cut her finger and saw her blood on the snow, Lenora didn't understand why seeing blood as such made her so emotional. She fell to her knees and pleaded with so much of pain in her soul that a strange feeling came over her. She knew she would soon have a child. And indeed, after a month she felt the child stirring. In the second month she grew pale and sick. In the third she knelt under the juniper tree and wept. By the fourth she felt better again, in the fifth she rejoiced, and in the sixth she was overjoyed, though in the seventh she became quiet. In the eighth she was uneasy, but in the ninth she gave birth to a beautiful boy named Bastian. However, her joy was short-lived, for she passed away moments after. Alric buried her beneath the juniper tree. He wept bitterly, but time passed and he found comfort again. After a year he remarried. His new wife Gertrude brought her own daughter into the home, Marlene. Many years later, when the boy was much older, his father got word of the inheritance allocated to Bastian. However, Bastian was still too young to decide what to do with such a large sum of riches. One day underneath the juniper tree, Marlene spoke to him about the inheritance. Despite them being step-siblings, their bond was stronger than that of blood. "What would you do with the inheritance?" Marlene asked. "Oh, that doesn't concern me," he replied. "But I think I'll split it in 3 ways. 1 portion for you, 1 portion for Mama, and 1 portion for Dad." Marlene was saddened. "You call my mother Mama, yet she treats you so poorly. Why don't you keep the money for yourself, Bastian?" asked Marlene. The boy, with his last piece of candy, broke it in half and gave it to his sister. He said, "Actually, I will take a portion of the money to buy something, but not for me." Marlene, now intrigued. "For who then?" she asks. "You better not be spending coin on those schoolgirls, they're not good for you." "For you," Bastian replied, "so you don't have to walk around barefoot like a cave woman in the heart of winter." The siblings laughed as Marlene chased Bastian around the juniper tree. When they tired themselves out, she said, "Okay, I tell you what. Till my little brother gets me a pair of the reddest shoes ever seen, I will remain walking barefoot. Be it summer, spring, autumn, or winter, I shall only wear the shoes that you give me." "Deal," Bastian said. One day, however, the stepmother couldn't contain her hatred any longer. Every time she looked at Bastian, she could only picture him drowning in money. Money that could be hers. How unfair, she thought. A 10-year-old boy would receive riches that a king doesn't even have. So she called the boy and said, "My child, will you get an apple from the chest under the juniper tree?" "Why, certainly, Mama," he replied. The chest was heavy and she had placed the lid so it would slam shut, the way that a hunter would set a trap for an animal. He bent over in the chest and with one swift movement, the lid fell onto the back of his neck. Panicked, the woman took a white cloth and tied the boy's head back onto his neck, making it seem like he wore a scarf. She sat him on a chair under the juniper tree and placed an apple in his hand. Marlene came home and asked where her brother was. "He's sitting by the tree with an apple. Ask him if he'll give you one," the mother said. So Marlene went to him and asked him for the apple, but he never replied. "Oh, stingy are we," she said. "You'll spend the inheritance buying me shoes, but you won't share an apple with me." However, when the silence grew longer, Marlene began panicking. She saw the white cloth around his neck turn to crimson, soaked in blood. "Bastian," she said, her voice quaky and wavering. She shook him and the head fell off. Screaming, she ran to her mother. Gertrude calmed her down, saying, "Don't worry. We'll keep it between us. No one must know. And if you tell your stepfather, I will say you did it. Next in line for the inheritance would be Alric, and he shall give it to me," said the mother. But surely Alric would see Bastian's lifeless body when he returned home. So Gertrude ordered Marlene to bury her brother under the juniper tree. Marlene refused and fought back, but Gertrude smacked her, holding a pitchfork at her head, forcing her to do the evil deed. Marlene was so traumatized she hid in her room under the bed, trembling with fear, so much so that her body seemed to be electrocuted. When Elric came home, he asked for his son. "Oh, he's gone to his uncle's house," the woman replied. Marlene, however, could not keep such a dark secret any longer. She ran to her stepfather and told him everything. Heartbroken and traumatized, Gertrude, Marlene, and the village folk found Elric hung by a rope at the juniper tree. Gertrude smiled wider this time. She never loved Elric. Hell, she never loved her own daughter. She only married Elric for the inheritance. Now her goal has made itself more attainable. She then filed a petition to Reverend Merrow. However, he told her it won't be that simple as she's making it out to be. Never has something like this happened before. Every council member would have to sign the petition and scrutinize the matter, since this would be a law-changing event that would probably take a couple of years. Marlene left the home after the incident. She walked barefoot in the cold winter, finding abandoned village houses to seek shelter in. She ate leftovers thrown on the floor from taverns and inns while working at the factories as a cleaner. But now, years later, Reverend Moreau arrived with the best possible news for Gertrude. She will receive the inheritance at 12 on this darker than usual, cold and eerie winter's midday. Though on the same day, in the early hours of the morning when darkness still prevailed by the juniper tree, something really strange occurred. The wind had gone still, not silent, but still, like the world itself held its breath. Beneath the skeletal branches of the juniper tree, the snow began to melt in a perfect circle, yet no sun shone above. From the frozen earth, the roots pulsed not with life, but with memory. Strange heat radiated outward and the soil cracked, split and sighed as if exhaling the secret that was held for too long. Then it began. The tree shivered and its bark groaned like an old door. Sap-like substance split down the center of the trunk, and from within, feathers emerged, slick, matted, and steaming. With a final heave, the raven was born, not as a hatchling but full-grown, its wings dark as midnight and its eyes burning red. Thus it began reciting the poem, the catchy tune that folk would hear and recite like a prayer. A child's grief twisted into melody, a sister's silence carried in rhythm, and a mother's cry etched into every note. Gertrude left her home at 11 a.m., making her way towards the council. She was too excited to wait an hour more for the gemstone. However, her gaze had been focused on the juniper tree in the backyard, far longer than it has since the incident. She heard the tree whispering to her, her husband's voice coming through. "What have you done?" he repeated over and over again. Gertrude saw her husband's lifeless body swaying on either side from the rope, sending shivers down her spine. But she pushes forward. Nothing will stop her today. The raven swooped in, pecking bits and pieces of skin off her face. But she pushes forward. The raven darted in front of her, making her lose balance, falling to her side and snapping her ankle, but still, she pushes forward. Like the gemstone had its own voice calling out to her wherever it was. Mercy. The raven was trying to give her a chance to repent. So she limps her way to the council, which now seemed an entire land away than a few moments ago. The villagers watch her, they pity her. Nevertheless, Gertrude arrived at the council panting like a dog and wincing in pain. "Where the hell is it then?" she shouts. "Give me what I'm owed." Reverend Moreau's face had the most disgusted expression when looking at her. Her skin looked like rotting flesh from the wounds caused by the raven. Her ankle bled out and left a trail of blood in the snow. He wanted no part or commission of this gemstone anymore. He didn't even look at her when he said, "You'll get what's coming to you. They are loading it onto the cart as we speak." However, when they walked behind the council building, the gemstone wasn't there. Infuriated, she hurled curses at the reverend and everyone nearby. "Thieves," she yells, "give me back my gemstone." However, the village folk told her they never took it. How could they? When the gemstone was so large that no human would be able to lift it, let alone carry it. Chatter, arguments, whispers, and gossip flood the land until they were silenced. The village clock struck 12 and the bell echoed throughout Mornby. The sky split open with the sound of wings. A thunderous flap stirred the air as the raven circled high above the village, casting a vast shadow over the square where the inheritance ceremony had frozen in shock. Gertrude below raises her hands towards the gemstone, her eyes wide with awe, not even realizing how or why the gemstone was floating high above her head. And from above, the raven releases the inheritance from its talons, burning with the red of winter blood spilled that day, plummeting with heaviness that only the raven could carry. Then it struck. The sound was final. Not a scream, not a cry, just the crack of bone and the wet thud of flesh, crushed beneath the greed that had once seemed priceless. Gertrude lay flattened underneath the gemstone, her spine broken, her limbs twisted unnaturally around it. Village folk made haste towards the gathering and gasped in horror, but Marlene, in her rag-like cloak, never showed expression. Maybe she felt relief. Maybe she was saddened that her own mother had met such a fate because of her greed, but still she doesn't show it. But then, the most peculiar thing happened to Marlene. The raven circled over her head with an item in its talons that was too small to see from the ground. Then it gently lowers itself, releasing the most simple yet beautiful and comfortable pair of red shoes Marlene had ever seen in her life. Tears filled her eyes as she fell to her knees, holding the shoes in her hand and crying. A gut-wrenching cry for what happened, for the silence in all these years, and for the painful realization of who the raven was. She spoke for the first time in a long time. "My bastion," she says. The raven cawed, bobbing its head while gently sitting in front of her, removing the shards of glass and splinters from his beloved sister's feet. However, Bastien also witnessed something that made him cry. The raven turned toward the juniper tree. With its branches rattling faintly despite the stillness of air, snow had begun to fall again, soft but short-lived, for beneath the tree something began stirring. Two figures stood side by side, half-formed in light. Lenora, pale and graceful, her hand resting gently on Elric's shoulder. They looked at the raven not in fear but in pride. They smiled and raised their hands in farewell as their forms dissolved into mist, carried away on the final breath of winter. The raven cawed once, quiet and broken, then turned its gaze towards the sky and noticed the snow had stopped. Marlene stepped toward her brother. "Thank you," she whispered. He was still a raven, but not just a bird. In his eyes was the boy she remembered, the warmth, the kindness, and the selfless nature blooming in his soul. Though now he couldn't speak, she understood everything he wanted to say. She slipped on the red shoes and together they walked through Mornby. The barefoot girl no longer barefoot and the raven no longer alone. Wherever they stepped, the snow began to melt. Reverend Moreau, now humble than before, bowed his head at Marlene and said, "Well, my child, the inheritance according to the petition law is now yours." Behind them, the juniper tree that held curses, wishes, and power from the soul stands tall, whispering gently in the wind, keeping the final secret of what had been buried and what had been reborn. Thank you all for watching and all for listening. Until the next one, do take care.